Welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 2, is the start of the First Nations and Inuit peoples episodes. Just so you know, I'll be making a few episodes on this topic before we get to the first contact with the European videos. This is important to know because this is where Canada started. This episode will be more general in nature, with the videos that follow focusing on different peoples. Different peoples, you ask? Yes. Broadly, there are peoples of the forest of the Canadian Shield, peoples of the plains, peoples of the Pacific Northwest, peoples of the British Columbia interior, and of course, peoples of the far north. That's why we say First Nations with an S. There was more than one nation here. Anyways, moving on. Did you know that no one really knows for sure when or how the First Nations and Inuit peoples came to be in the Americas to become its first Canadians? The most commonly accepted when view is that this happened about 15,000 years ago, with the oldest confirmed cultural site in the Americas being dated to 13,350 years ago. Some experts even go as far back as 100,000 years ago. So there's no confusion here. The how is just as varied depending on which expert you consult. One theory is that people came from Asia by land. They crossed over the Bering Land Bridge. This was a land bridge that joined present-day Russia to Alaska when sea levels were much lower during the last ice age. Another theory is that people from Asia traveled by watercraft along the western coast of North America. Another is by people sailing from island to island across the northern Pacific Ocean. And yet another theory is that people reached the east coast of the Americas from Iceland and Greenland. Again, no confusion here. But what is a certainty is that First Nations and Inuit peoples were living, thriving, and creating nations and cultures for over 15,000 years before any Europeans landed. So the Americas were not uninhabited, and the Americas were not undiscovered. It's important to understand that the Europeans did not discover, as they say, the New World in a sense that it was uninhabited, but discovered it in the sense that the Europeans didn't know that it even existed at the time. This is an important distinction to understand. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines discover as a verb meaning to make known or visible or to expose. It also defines it as to obtain sight of or knowledge of for the first time or to find. So, for the Europeans, they discovered an inhabited new world previously unknown to them. Anyways, English lesson aside, the European invasion, because that's what it was slow and spanned decades, if not centuries. And it all started with trade. Trade routes already existed between First Nations peoples long before the Europeans arrived, and when the Europeans did arrive, trade was good between them. Europeans brought metal goods like iron, weapons, axes, and cooking pans, all of which revolutionized the First Nations. But not all trade goods were beneficial, though. The Europeans also brought alcohol and Christian missionaries, which greatly damaged First Nation cultures. But even worse than these were the infectious diseases that came with the Europeans. They brought smallpox, measles, influenza, lung infections, and even the common cold. These diseases were deadly to the First Nations. Entire populations collapsed. A terrible example of this impact is with the Huron Confederacy in Northern Ontario. In 1600, their population was estimated at about 25,000 people. By 1640, only 40 years later, a smallpox epidemic killed thousands, reducing their population to only about 9,000 people. The Hurons were then overrun by the Iroquois and were basically destroyed. And here's an even more disturbing fact. Ethnohistorian Henry Dobbins estimated that the First Nations and Inuit populations to be more than 18 million people prior to European contact. Over the next 130 years, this fell by a staggering 95%. It's hard to get your head around this kind of fact. Well, with that scary fact still simmering, that's it for this short introduction to First Nations and Inuit peoples. And remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And stay tuned for episode 3, The People of the Woods. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.